Hello everyone. Today's mini lecture is from chapter 10, Change in a Chaotic and Unpredictable Environment. But we'll also be talking about global social change organizations. So this is for session 5.1. Let's go on. So organizations that go global, so in other words, these are organizations that are no longer existing in one country and they decide perhaps to go abroad and start doing their services or products in other countries. They have to encounter a lot of different challenges. Um, Among them is offering products and services in more than one country. Means that you need to manage your direct investments in these countries. And knowing that in each country there are multiple geographic and cultural boundaries. So in other words, each culture or each country that you go to would have a different culture, and therefore the way you manage things in this country might be slightly different from the way you manage things in your own country. There are unique product requirements. There are taxes that are different from one country to the other. Government regulations are often very different, and companies need to be aware of trade agreements and try to maximize perhaps their opportunities presented by these trade agreements. Even transportation laws might be quite different from one country to the other. Transporting your goods from one country to an export location, for example, may have restrictions depending on the laws of that country. There are functional concerns with the geographic issues of distance, time, and culture. You need to carry out coordinated activities across cultural boundaries using a wide variety of personnel, expatriates or local employees. So what this means is you need to be able to help each other out, even if you're in a different country. And aside from that, you need to get basically instructions coming from the original company for your country of origin. The strategic initiatives have to be well coordinated, even if you're living or you're working in another country. Employees with different cultural backgrounds means different challenges in the way you manage them. So some countries have low power distance, wherein you don't really need to be so formal and people treat each other like friends. But in high power distance countries, people in position may demand certain respect with the way they deal with people, and their subordinates have to give that attention and respect to their superiors. This is for high power distance countries. So human resource management practices, or HRM, must fit the culture and the objectives of the firm and the country where they operate. So the next slide shows us 4 different ways to categorize global companies, or in other words, companies that operate in more than one country. And this table shows us 2 dimensions. The first dimension is when there is a strong need for global integration, in other words, a high need for global integration. This means that when you start a company in another country, there has to be very close coordination with the mother company from the home country for various reasons. One very common reason for that close coordination is that the design of the product comes from the home country, and the design of this product is such that perhaps the more you make of this product, the greater the efficiencies or the lower the cost becomes of this product. So that means that the name of the game is to come out with one uniform product um, produce as much as you can of this product and drive down the costs of making this product. And you need a lot of global integration to be able to do that. So oftentimes, companies with a very high global integration need, their products are very standard. So they don't really change from one country to the other. So Toyota might be coming out with a car, but the car is very much the same regardless of where they sell this car. Except, of course, if you are in a left-hand driving nation, then your steering wheel has to be on the right. And if you're driving on the right side of the road, then your steering wheel has to be on the left. So really the customization will be minimal in that sense. And because you are producing a lot of these cars, then you're driving down the cost of these cars. That's what we call uh, efficiencies and economic efficiencies. Um, the other dimension is the need for local responsiveness. So some countries, or some companies rather, would require that their product is customized so that it sells very well in each country that it sells to. An example of this would be Nestle, of the food company. The food that they come out with is basically food in general is highly customized because each country would have a very different taste. In many South continent countries like India and Pakistan, spices in their food might be very strong, and they may be looking for food that is hot and has a lot of spices at the same time. Where in countries, Western nations like Australia, perhaps may not have that very strong need for spice in their food. So you can imagine that the food that you come up with, if you are Nestle, has to be tailor made for that particular taste in that country. So that's a great example of high need to locally respond to the demands of the market. So depending on that combination of the need for global integration and the need for local responsiveness, you can plot where a typical company might belong. So again, Nestle having to respond to the food uh, tastes of their market might have a multinational orientation because there's a very high need for local responsiveness, but then they don't really, there's a low need to globally integrate. So in other words, their food, the food products that they may come up with are only sold in that particular nation or group of nations. But then if you are a country who's just simply exporting products, you're making it in your home country and you're exporting it to another country with very little customization, you might have what we call an international orientation. And this international orientation means that you don't really need to drive up your production of the product because there's no advantage in cost. And therefore, there's no need to have that high global integration. So you would belong in this particular quadrant. The global orientation, on the other hand, is when you need to have really strong coordination between the home country and the foreign country, and the operations that they have to be very coordinated. An example of this, you might have a operation in China, for example, which needs a lot of materials coming from different countries. And therefore, they need to be very well coordinated with their operations in different countries. A good example of this, by the way, is the case study that I've given out. It's called OzStar. So those students who are using this case study, you will note that the company has a somewhat a global orientation. So there is a need for them to coordinate their Australian operations with their Chinese operations. In fact, they say they were saying that they needed to send people from Australia to work and help out the Chinese operation. Now, that's a good example of a high need for global integration. And there's really no evidence that because it's an industrial product, then there's no evidence that they need to tailor fit this product to the local market. So again, that's a global orientation. If your company is in a market where there is a strong need for global integration, but also a strong need for local responsiveness, then you would need to have what we call a transnational orientation. A good example of this would be digital products or mobile phone products or smartphone products. You will note that while they are perhaps made in one country, like China, and there's a strong need to sort of drive down the cost, and therefore what you do is you centralize manufacturing in one country, which basically makes that operation really specialized, and they become really good at driving down the cost of the product, and also of course the quality of the product is very good because of that specialization. However, the products that they come up with might be slightly different depending on the nation which they are selling it to. So again, that would mean that they need to be highly responsive to the local markets that they sell their products to. So Apple, for example, not just Apple, but even Samsung, they come up with products that then can be customized depending on where you are selling this product to. So I might choose the Arabic language in my phone. So if I'm an Arab and I basically use this smartphone in Saudi Arabia, for example, um, but then if you are Chinese, you would want your phone to be using Chinese characters. So that's an example of a strong need for local responsiveness. Yet they're able to produce everything from one factory. Well, one or two factories, which drives down the cost. Now, this kind of operation and customization is because, of course, software can be used to customize your phone. But that's a great example of a transnational orientation where you are maximizing the fact that you are a network of organizations around the world. You're trying to drive down the cost, but at the same time, you're coming up with a product that is tailor fit to your market. So let's explain each one of these in more detail. So the international strategic orientation, as mentioned before, is when your company is operating in a market where there's a low need for local responsiveness and also a low need for global integration. So a great example again is when you're simply making a product and you're exporting it. The organization is making its first attempt at operating outside of its country's market. So this is really what we say the first step in becoming a global company. By the way, you may have, if you've taken international business, there is a very similar diagram which we use in that unit, which talks about the types of global companies. So the characteristics of the international design is you sell existing products and services to foreign markets. So you may be selling a particular noodles, especially if you're a noodle company, you're operating in China, and you're making noodles, and you decide, oh, I'm going to just there's a demand for my product in Australia, and I might simply package it in the same way, and I put a sticker on top in English which explains what my product is, and then I just simply ship the product to Australia. So that's really a very simple way of doing business internationally. When you are an organizational development practitioner in a company that has an international strategic orientation, what you're doing really there is to facilitate extending the existing strategy into that new market. So the things you might be doing will be helping out in cross-cultural training for your marketing department, for example, and maybe some helping out in strategic planning within the mother organizations. The OD practitioner usually in this case works and lives in the host country, the country of origin. So the next is the global strategic orientation. And this is what I was saying. OzStar is, I think, in this stage where there is a high need for global integration, but because it's an industrial product, then there's a low need for local responsiveness. The machines or the products they come up with don't need to cater to a particular culture. So you might just use the same product in Australia and produce it in China while using the same specifications, the same process. But in order for you to do that, you need to be able to train the people in that new location. And in order for you to do that, you basically need to have formal systems. And this is what I was driving at um, with Allstar. Allstar is an Australian company locating itself in Australia and also opening a location in China. But they need to be able to duplicate their operations in Australia and make it the same in China. But you can understand that if you want to do that, you will need to have formal rules and procedures and processes in place so that you could use that same design and bring it to China. If you don't have a formal system, then you are forced to use people from your home country and send them to the foreign nation, which is, of course, very stressful for these employees. Nobody wants to be working away from home. Um, so the characteristics of the global design are a very centralized product design. So it's designed in one country um, with marketing a standardized product in different countries. So it's the same product, you're simply marketing it in another country. So the goal here is efficiency. So the more you make, the more expert you become at making it, and you're able to drive down the costs um, because of the economies of scale. So if you're working as an OD practitioner in a company like that has a global strategic operation or orientation, then what you're doing there is you're supporting career planning, you're clarifying job positions and job roles. You are designing good job descriptions. Perhaps you're starting to put in job enrichment or job rotation type of interventions. You're getting employees involved in day-to-day change management. You're managing the conflicts. So oftentimes, if you've got people from different cultures, risk of people having conflicts or a little bit of fighting or arguments might happen. And an OD practitioner might practice trying to smooth out these conflicts. And of course, team building of senior management. So senior management in the home country and also senior management in the host country or the new country where they're operating. OD helps the organization transition away from the local towards the global. So here we are realizing that while we are still operating from Australia, and we're operating in, for example, in China, you have to realize that each one is different, each locality is different, and you need to think about not just the Australian way of doing things, but also cater to the Chinese employees as well. So the next orientation is the multinational orientation, where there might be a high need for local responsiveness. So in other words, you have to tailor fit your products to the local demands and the local market. But there's also a low need for global integration. So Here, the operation is almost independent of the mother country or the mother company. So they're operating it in a very independent fashion. They don't need to integrate themselves with the home country operation. Perhaps they're doing their own product design, and also perhaps the food. For example, if it's a food company, the food demands are very different. The taste demands are very different in that country. Um, and the characteristics of that is you have a very decentralized organization. So there's very, again, independent thinking that's going on in the headquarters. They don't need to follow any actions or any broad strategic decisions coming from the home country. So the goals of local responsiveness are basically specialization, or your products have to be very tailor fit to that particular market. Again, if you're a OD practitioner, you basically help with intergroup relations, the selection of local managers, team building within that particular country, and you're designing team building activities that fit to the culture of that particular region. You also facilitate development of management within that country. You are designing reward systems that are specific to that the culture that you are working in. In this case, usually the OD practitioner resides in the country, the host country, or in other words, the country where that operation has moved to or has opened a location in. By the way, a good thought here would be in terms of reward systems. We know that each culture might value different types of rewards. In Western nations, the rewards tend to be very materialistic. So they are looking for monetary rewards or financial rewards. But in many Asian nations, what's more important to employees might be recognition, or perhaps a promotion, a rise in social status. So you can see that depending on the culture, they value different things. So therefore, your reward system has to be tailor fit for the market where you are operating in. The last strategic orientation is a transnational orientation. In this case, there is a high need for local responsiveness, but also a high need for global integration. So the example I gave earlier for example, Apple or Samsung, where they have to come up with a standard product, but at the same time, they need to be able to customize this product depending on the nation where they're operating in. Sometimes one country might have a different mobile phone system, and therefore, for example, Japan has a very different technology behind their cell phones, and therefore your phone has to be able to cater to that market, but at the same time cater to the U.S. market. It needs to have a need for Japanese language within the phone, but also have English language on that phone. So they can still integrate their global operations. In other words, parts are made in different countries, but they're brought together in one location where it's put together and manufactured. A mobile phone, for example, might have different parts coming from Malaysia, the Philippines, electronic parts that are made in different countries, and then they're brought together in one country like China, and it's manufactured in a global scale. So they put together hundreds and thousands of products that are then shipped from China into other nations. You can see that the integration is very high. The need to integrate your operations in different countries is quite high. So as I said, tailored products, characteristics of this design, the goals of learning and responsiveness through integrations are there. So in other words, each country must learn from another country. So the way they work together is very close. They're integrated. They continually communicate with each other. They receive instructions from the home country, but at the same time, they have to coordinate their operations with other operations in other nations. Now, the role of the OD practitioner in such an operation might be very, very extensive selection and rotation of employees. So um, promoting the fact that you can bring an employee from one country to the other so that they can learn from other countries is a big thing. It improves communication, it improves understanding between countries and companies, but they also need to acquire cultural knowledge and develop intergroup relations. So uh, the OD practitioner would have to be familiar with multiple cultures, not just one or two. Oops. And also, part of the role of the OD practitioner is to build a corporate vision. So in other words, an overall strategy or an overall mission for that company has to be well established, where while you are operating in a local country, you see yourself as a member of a larger organization. And therefore, you have a common vision, a common objective as a big company. So the next topic we're going to be talking about, and it's still related to this global paradigm. So in other words, we are examining companies that operate in different countries, are what we call the global social change organizations. So global social change organizations are generally not for profit. They're not operating to make money, although they still need money to operate. But these companies have a purpose, and that purpose is usually a charitable or a social purpose. An example of this is the Worldwide Fund for Nature, or WWF. You see that panda logo there, which is very familiar to most people. And WWF started as a company whose mission was to conserve wildlife. But as it grew larger and more sophisticated, you might say, they realized that it's just more than taking care of wildlife or animals. It's also taking care of the environment in general, because we know that if we take care of the environment, we are actually taking care of animals, but also people. So they've tackled climate change as well. So trying to reduce the effects of climate change, or at least to slow down the effects of climate change and global warming. So WWF operates in hundreds of countries, so not just Europe, but they also have locations in the Philippines, in China, in Australia, et cetera, et cetera. So when you're a global social change organization, you are actually applying organizational development in an international setting. So similar to global for-profit organizations, but you sort of have to integrate your operations across the world. And companies like Amnesty International, whose main role is to try to defend human rights in many countries where human rights perhaps are not given as much attention. And these organizations address social issues such as overpopulation, ecological degradation, in other words, the environment, such as WWF, and also the lack of fundamental human rights. So what these companies or these organizations usually do is they get wealthy donors to give money to them. Wealthy donors might come from the United States or from Australia. They give money to these organizations, and these organizations use that money to operate not just in the home country, but also in countries where human rights is basically not as respected, or where there's often multiple violations of human rights happening. So WWF, for example, goes to many poor nations, uses the money from the international fund to try to protect the environment, or perhaps promote the protection of the environment in these countries. So global social change organizations are agents of change, if you think about it. And that's why we're studying them, because what they're trying to do there is implement change. And they might follow the same change models that we are using. In fact, the same techniques that we're using in companies, but this time they're trying to implement this across an entire society. So they are agents of change in the creation of an environmentally and socially sustainable world. So their main goal is usually it's a three P's, right? So they are trying to protect the planet, they're trying to protect people, but they're making sure that, of course, the economy, the profit part, continues, because we all know we need the economy to continue to operate in order to lift people out of poverty. So what these organizations do is they mobilize innovative social organizational architecture. So in other words, organizational change techniques to try to create social change within countries. Empowerment is a key value in their mission. So in other words, they don't go to countries and force people to change. They usually involve communities and give them the power to basically change their own communities. So that power means you give them the knowledge, you give them the skills, you guide them, but the actual change is done by the people themselves, and that's why it's called empowerment. So these organizations are usually globally and locally linked in structure, membership, or partnership. So World Vision, whose main purpose is basically to help the poor, to lift people out of poverty, especially in nations where they're not that rich and the governments don't have as much money. World Vision works there in communities, and they use their strong membership in more well-to-do nations, and they use that money, and sometimes they funnel that money into other nations as well. Um, in the applications change, what OD practitioners do, especially with the stakeholders within these communities, is first of all, they build the local organization using values to create that vision. Then they create horizontal linkages, or they build a network of local organizations with similar views and objectives, and they help each other out. So again, as I was saying, you might have a network where there's a rich organization, a rich chapter of WWF, which helps out a poorer chapter in a nation with not as much donations, and they build that project using money from more wealthy or organizations or chapters. The other thing that's important in these social change organizations is vertical linkages. So in other words, they have communication with local government and use that influence to try to change policy within that government, and also help governments make the right decisions in terms of their environment, or in terms of social progress. So I don't know if I've said this before, but I used to work for WWF in the Philippines. And one example of what we would do is we would try to influence government to come up with new laws that protect the environment. new laws that basically might declare a particular area as a conservation area to protect it from, overfishing or overexploitation of these these areas of environment. So global social change organizations are actually, as I said, change agents, and their roles and skills are as follows. These change agents need to have a stewardship role, a co-participant in achieving global change. In other words, practitioner has to share the values of the organization. So um, if you work for WWF, obviously you need to believe in that goal of trying to reduce, for example, global warming or climate change. And you need to have that value. In other words, you need to be to find the environment as something very close to your heart. But you also need to have a good bridging role. So in other words, you're a good communicator if you're an OD practitioner working for these organizations. And your main role um, in bridging is you're trying to bring together diverse elements of societies, the rich people and the poor people, the rich community and the poor communities. You're also trying to bridge government policy, or you're trying to bridge government services with poorer communities. You're so, in other words, to carry out these roles, you need to have very good communication skills, very good negotiation skills. You must have a good power base within the government. In other words, be able to build contacts within the government that can help you uh, perform your function or to accomplish your mission. You need to have good networking skills, so building relationships with different powerful organizations that can help you accomplish your mission. And so that's it for today's mini lecture. Stay tuned for your succeeding mini lectures, 5.2 and so forth, so on. Have a good one.